One wintry morning in 1922, Andreas Gruber looked uneasily at the line of footprints in the snow that were leading from the dense, dark forest in the northwest of his farm, known as the Witch's Wood, to an isolated outbuilding on his property. It just didn't make sense. A single line of footprints was clearly visible, leading directly to this small building, and upon inspection, the lock on the door of the building was broken. But when the farmer looked inside, no one was there. This didn't make any sense because there were no footprints leading away from the building, only footprints going towards it. And yet, no one was there. Andreas was baffled by these footprints in the snow. He had searched all of the outbuildings on the property as well as the farmhouse itself, again and again. He found nothing at all. There was no explanation whatsoever for these tracks that were clearly there. Over the past 6 months, the people who lived and worked in the farmhouse and on the farm had been plagued by the sounds of someone or something moving around in the windowless attic that ran the entire length of the farmhouse. Objects had been moved when no one was there, and eventually the maid, after trying repeatedly to convince Andreas that the house was haunted, finally gave up and quit her position at the farm in September of 1921, 6 months before the strange footprints in the snow suddenly appeared. She quit because she was terrified to be there any longer, and she was convinced that the farmhouse was haunted by something. But when Andreas searched for the source of her claims, he didn't find anything. However, this didn't stop her from spreading her stories in the nearby town, that the isolated farm of Hinterkaifeck was haunted. In fact, she believed so strongly in her claims that she told anyone who would listen that the farmhouse in which she had worked as a maid was haunted by a spirit. She explained that she had repeatedly heard someone or something moving around in the attic when the house was empty, and on more than one occasion, she said that she had heard the sound of disembodied voices. She also said that she would experience a sudden and overwhelming feeling that she was being watched when she was alone in the house. The Hinterkaifeck farm was run by Andreas Gruber, his wife Gisela, and their daughter Victoria, as well as Victoria's 2 children, her 7-year-old daughter, who was also named Gisela, and her 2-year-old son Joseph. Every now and then, Andreas, after downing a few drinks in the local pub, actually admitted to a few local townspeople that he himself had experienced odd experiences in this house. The townspeople were eager to hear the stories from Andreas himself, since up until that point, all they heard were the claims of Andreas's former maid. He told them that on one occasion, he found a current edition of a Munich newspaper in his house. He assumed that the mailman had left it by mistake and that another member of the family had brought it into the house from the mailbox. But no one in the house admitted to having seen the newspaper, and then he asked the mailman about it, and the mailman told him that no one in the village subscribed to that particular newspaper, and so he could not have delivered it in error to Hinterkaifeck because he would not have had it in his mailbag for delivery in the first place. Andreas also grudgingly admitted that perhaps he had also heard what might have been footsteps in the attic as well. But when he had checked to see who might be up there, he didn't find anyone, and because of this, he brushed it off, thinking that he was just hearing things. But something he could not brush off were the times where he had found the farm animals out in the field when he had left them in the barn. Andreas asked everyone who lived and worked on the farm who had let the animals out, but nobody admitted to it. And then finally, there was the time that one of the sets of keys for the houses and the outbuildings had disappeared from their usual designated spot. No one in the house would admit to having moved them, and this disappearance of these keys clearly bothered Andreas. Unsurprisingly, no one wanted to live and work in a haunted house deep in the forest, and so for several months Andreas had to manage the farm without a maid. But in March of 1922, 45-year-old Maria Baumgartner agreed to take the job. On Friday, March 31st of 1922, Maria arrived at Hinterkaifeck ready to begin her duties the following day. Nobody seen Maria Baumgartner or any other members of the Hinterkaifeck household over the following weekend. But that wasn't really a matter of concern. It was just assumed that the family had chosen not to make the trip to town that weekend. Maybe it was because of bad weather. On Saturday afternoon, 2 brothers visited the farm, but no one answered when they knocked on the door, and then later that evening, a local carpenter walked past the house on his way home, and he noticed that the kitchen door was open, and he could clearly see a fire burning in the fireplace. On Sunday, 2 friends of Victoria's came by the farmhouse to take her to church, but no one answered when they knocked on the door. While they were there, they seen smoke rising from the chimney of the farmhouse, indicating that everything was normal. So the 2 girls just thought that nobody was home at that time, and they turned and left. Then Monday came, and 7-year-old Kazilla did not show up for school. People also noted that she had not attended school on Saturday morning either, which was completely abnormal for the young girl. The mailman, who dropped off the mail that Monday morning, noticed that the back door of the farmhouse was partially open, but he didn't see anyone, and neither did the mechanic who arrived that afternoon to fix some farm equipment, though he did hear a dog barking inside the house when he arrived. When he left after completing his repairs, he noticed that the dog, which was still barking, had been moved and was now tied up beside the front door, indicating that clearly someone was in the house, because someone had relocated the dog. And then by Tuesday afternoon, when nobody had seen any of the family for days, there was sufficient concern over their absence that a small group of men nervously approached the Hinterkaifeck farmhouse. When they got there, everything looked normal. The animals were happy and healthy and had clearly been fed, but strangely, the mail had not been collected from the mailbox. The men opened the door to the farmhouse, peered inside, and called out to the family, but there was no answer. Everything looked normal except for some dirty dishes in the kitchen sink. Things were not as simple though when the group of men entered the Hinterkaifeck barn that day. The horrors that were about to be uncovered would baffle all of Germany for decades. Inside the barn, they discovered what had happened to at least some of the members of the Gruber household. Under a thin layer of hay, they found the blood-spattered bodies of Andreas and Kazilla Gruber, as well as Victoria and her young daughter, Kazilla. All of them had been killed by a single savage blow to the head, and then their bodies were stacked in a pile in the hay. After seeing this gruesome scene in the barn, the group of men went back inside the house and made a more thorough search, and that is when they discovered the bodies of Maria Baumgartner and Joseph. Maria's body was in the maid's bedroom off the kitchen, and Joseph was in his cot. And like the victims in the barn, both Maria and Joseph had sustained massive head injuries. Rather than making things more clear, the ensuing police investigation highlighted just how odd this case was. Autopsies were performed the following day out in the courtyard of the Hinterkaifeck farm, and the autopsies confirmed that all 6 of the victims had been killed sometime late that Friday. But witnesses had seen smoke coming from the chimney of the house during the week. The carpenter had seen someone with a flashlight at the farm on Saturday evening. The repairman claimed that someone had moved the dog while he was at the farm on Monday, and it was clear that the farm animals and dog had been fed and looked after. Unbelievably, this strongly suggested that whoever had savagely killed the family on Friday evening had spent a leisurely 3 days in the Gruber household after the murders. And even more concerning, perhaps this intruder had been living with the family undetected long before the murders. Maybe the ghost wasn't a ghost. The autopsies confirmed that all 6 victims had been killed by a single blow to the head, most likely with a mattock, which is a farming tool that has a blade on one side and a chisel-like axe on the other side. Disturbingly, the bodies in the barn had not been dragged into the barn after death. No. Somehow, the killer had managed to lure his victims out to the barn, one by one, and there he would lay in wait until the victims entered the barn, at which time he brought the mattock down, killing them with a single blow to the head. Not one of the family members showed any signs that they had been bound or restrained in any way, and none of them had any defensive wounds. It was as if each victim had meekly entered the barn looking for the person who had entered before them, unknowingly delivering themselves right into the hands of their killer. At first, detectives suspected robbery as the motive, but that was quickly dismissed when a search by police discovered a large quantity of gold coins and valuable jewelry in the house. One thing that the police search, complete with police dogs, failed to find was the murder weapon. No mattock could be found in the house or outbuildings, so it was assumed that the killer must have taken it with him. After that, detectives began looking for a more personal motive. They discovered that Victoria had told friends that the father of her son was a local man, Mr. Schlittenbauer. They also discovered that Victoria had recently started proceedings to sue Schlittenbauer for money to help support her son. Police interrogated Schlittenbauer several times over the years. The suggested motive didn't really seem particularly strong, but the truth was that detectives had no other leads. The farm on which Schlittenbauer lived with his wife was less than 1 kilometer from Hinterkaifeck, and he admitted to having had a relationship with Victoria, but he absolutely denied being the murderer, and it seemed impossible that he could have spent time at Hinterkaifeck from Friday evening until the bodies were discovered on Tuesday afternoon without someone having noticed his absence from his place. And so the police dropped Schlittenbauer as a suspect. The bodies of all 6 victims were buried a few days later, and they were buried without their heads. Their heads were kept in evidence just in case they were later needed in a trial. But to add insult to injury, their heads were eventually lost during the chaos that ensued in Germany during World War II. To this day, the Grubers remain buried without their heads. Less than 1 year after the murders, in February of 1923, Hinterkaifeck was demolished. And it was during this demolition that a mattock was found underneath the floorboards inside the farmhouse. The mattock was crusted with dried blood as well as hair and was strongly believed to be the murder weapon. But nobody could explain why it was not found by police search dogs back in 1922. Munich detectives interviewed more than 100 potential suspects between 1922 and 1933, but failed to find sufficient evidence to charge any of them with the Hinterkaifeck murders. And so, it is doubtful that this case will ever be solved. So that's going to wrap it up for this video. Thank you for watching, and if you haven't already, please make sure to like, subscribe, and toss a comment below. Let me know what you think, because I would love to find out. And I will see you again later.